Okay, we're going to get started on the 14-inch blocks that will be used for all of the following small projects. And I thought I'd just take a minute and give a quick overview of this block and just a few things to know before we're going to get started. So we are going to make a compass sunflower block, skinny here with the skinny ruler and book, and fat over here made with the fat book and ruler. So you can make either of these projects, either the skinny or the fat, to complete the following small projects. So quickly, when you open your books to the front cover, you'll see there are 4 color-coded chapters. The first chapter is all about making a mariner's compass. That is the basic compass block, and we will use some steps from this chapter because all blocks begin the same way. The second chapter are the companion compass blocks. So this compass sunflower block that we're making, most of the instructions will be included here. The third chapter is traditional round finishing. We will use one of those methods, the applique method, for one of the small projects. And then the fourth chapter is the octocompass chapter and no circle finishing. We are also going to work in here just a tidge because number one, we're going to cut our strips using this octocompass chapter, and I will explain that moving forward. We will also turn some of these blocks for some of the projects into the actual octocompass blocks, so we'll use more of those instructions when we do those projects. All right, so we'll go ahead and just turn the page here. The first thing is a few tips to know before getting started. Really important for you to pay attention to this page. You will need a straight edge ruler with either a 45-degree angle for skinny or a 60-degree angle for fat, as it's showing here. Now, you can use my angle ruler that's pictured here in your book. It will make life easier because the angles are going to be in the middle of the ruler. If you have another straight edge ruler that you would like to use, that's great. You will find, though, most straight edge rulers have those angles on one end or the other. You'll note that I've drawn a line in the middle of the ruler, and I've talked about that up in the straight edge ruler. So if you wanted to take a regular straight edge ruler and get a 60-degree or a 45-degree line more in the middle, that might be helpful. 1/4-inch seam. It's going to be important that you sew an accurate and more of a true 1/4-inch seam than a scant. This is so that your blocks will size correctly, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then pressing. Pressing is probably one of the most important parts of making these blocks. If you take the time to press as you go, and I do give press as you go instructions, and you get the seams laying flat and in the proper direction, your block is going to lay flat from the get-go and come to size. So let me just talk about that for a minute. You want your block, when you're done, to be as pretty on the back as it is on the front. So you can see how these seams are all laying nice and flat, which allows your block to lay flat again when you finish construction. So if you take the time again to make sure that you're pressing the way I tell you and in the proper direction. You do not want to use any moisture or steam in the construction of the raw block. So as you're pressing along, if you add moisture as you're going, you're going to tend to stretch your block out of shape. Your points will get off of north, south, east, and west. So you want to make sure that you're using a dry iron in the pressing steps, and I will talk about that more as we move forward. I talked about our blocks coming to size. So the blocks that we're going to use for these small projects are 14-inch blocks. That means we want our blocks to finish 14 inches across the diameter from finished point to finished point, or actually just a tidge less. And the reason we want it to just be right under 14 is because then when we do go to finish the outside, however we're going to finish it into our project, that we're not going to cut those pretty points off. If your block finish is too large, then that's what's going to happen. So the goal here with a true 1/4-inch seam is to get our block to finish slightly smaller than 14 inches from finished point to finished point. And again, I will talk more about this as we move through the process. We are going to cut our strips from the Octocompass chapter. When you cut from the Octocompass chapter, you're cutting your background strip wider than you would if you use the table from the chapter in the book for your particular block. By cutting the background strip wider, it's going to give us more room around the perimeter of the raw block, so more room out beyond these finished points. And that's going to allow us to take these blocks and to make them into any of these various small projects that we'll be following. I want you to also notice the outside of the blocks. They are finished kind of wonky. Things don't really match perfectly out here, and you don't need to worry about them matching. You never try to match everything perfectly out here. I kind of call this Las Vegas. What happens out there happens. So just know that there's going to be plenty of room beyond those finished points, but you do not have to worry about matching anything around the perimeter. Again, I will talk about this as we go through the construction of the raw block. And then lastly, you might notice my center. So for these small projects, we're going to do a reverse applique center, which means we're going to put a piece of fabric on the back underneath. We're going to fold these points under on the top, and then you just sew around here, and it's going to give you an octagon shape for the center of your block. But this way you don't have to worry about making a circle center. This is a little bit easier way to get your center of your block finished. So I think that's all the info that you need to know before getting started. When we come back, we'll just start in making these raw blocks from start to finish. And then in the videos after that, you'll see the videos for making all of the various small projects. Okay, we're going to start in on the construction of our Compass sunflower blocks. I'm going to demo skinny and fat side by side through all of the steps for making the raw blocks so you can see them side by side. So the first thing, we need to go to our second chapter in our book for the Compass sunflower construction. So that's going to start on page 2 in the second chapter. And we are going to first cut the strips for our block. Now there is a PDF download that's going to give you all the strip widths that you need, but I'm going to take just a second here to explain how you get to these strip widths. So when you go on to do other projects, you'll understand sort of how my system works. So the first thing you have to decide is if you're going to do a round finish block, which you would use the table below here, or if you're going to do the Octocompass finish. And I talked in the overview about the fact that we are going to do the Octocompass finish. That is going to give us more room around the perimeter of the raw block for finishing. So you just need to know that before you get started, because when you get to 1, it says figure out which strips you will need to cut. We're going to cut the Octocompass strips. So that means we need to go to the 4th chapter. Notice how Octocompasses is in navy blue. That's referring you to the navy blue chapter. You need to go to page 4. Same for the fat. So it's pink here. We're going to the pink chapter to page 4. And that's where you're going to find the tables for cutting your strips. Then you find your block. We're doing an octocompass sunflower block. So it's the second row of numbers down here. We're making a 14-inch block. So the strips that you need are going to be listed right below that 14. For skinny, it's 2 3.5-inch background strips, 2 2-inch 0.1 strips, 2 2.5 0.2 strips, and 1 2-inch 0.3 strip. For the fat, you're going to need 1 4-inch background strip, 1 2.5-inch 0.1 strip, 2 3.25-inch 0.2 strips, and 1 2 3/4-inch inside 0.3 strip. So now I've got my strips cut. We can go ahead and go back to the Compass Sunflower chapter. It's where we started on page 2, and we can go ahead and move along to the next step. So number 2, it just says to cut your background 0.1, 0.2, and inside 0.3 strips for the size block. We have done that. So we'll come back in the next video and move on from there. Okay, moving on, we are now on step 3 in the Compass Sunflower chapter. So it's telling you now that you are going to follow Mariner's Compass steps 3 through 8. And you'll notice again, these are color coded. So every block, so any of the companion blocks, the Mariner's Compass, all blocks start the same way. You're always going to do these steps 3 through 8. And then for some of the blocks, like the Compass Sunflower, then you're going to go on to make these units into pie shapes, which is step 4, which are steps 9 through 15. So basically steps 3 and 4 are telling you to go back to the Mariner's Compass chapter and follow steps 3 through 15. So I think it's a good idea to use some sticky notes because we're going to be going back and forth a little bit. I am going to put a sticky note here at the bottom of step 4 because that is where I'm going to go come back to once I finish those steps. Now I'm going to go to the Mariner's Compass chapter. So that's the first chapter, and it's telling me to follow steps 3 through 15. So I keep going. So step 15 is on page 8. You can see that pie shape. I'm going to put another sticky note there, which tells me when I get to this sticky note, then I know to go back where I'm going to move on. So same thing here. We'll move this. We're in the Mariner's Compass. We're going all the way through step 15 to the pie shape, and I'm putting my sticky note there. All right. Now I'm going to go back. And again, we're going to start with step 3. So when we come back, we'll start in there and continue on. Okay, step 3 is offsetting our background in 0.1 strips and then sewing them together using our true 1/4-inch seam. So I'm going to start. I will demo first the skinny, so I'm just going to set the book here so we can look at it. Offsetting, you're going to take your background strip, you're going to put it face up, and we need to offset because this is skinny at a 45-degree angle. So you're going to take your straight edge ruler and you are going to lay the 45-degree line down the edge, the right-hand edge of your strip. Then you're going to move it up so that the ruler is as high as it can be, but where it intersects over here on the left is below the selvage. That way, when we go to cut our units, we will be cutting those selvages off. So once you've got the 45 here, where it intersects over here is below the selvage, then you're going to take one of your 0.1 strips, and then where it does intersect on the side that we're going to sew, you're going to place that selvage So you can see I have the space down, but I can still see the selvage. Make sure the selvage is just above where the ruler intersects. So I'm just going to hold that, pull the ruler out, and stick a pin in there. All right, we have two strip sets to offset here. So for the second one, if you don't want to use your ruler again, here's a little tip for you. You can just take your background strip, your second one, put it even with the other one, and then just line this up. And then both of them are offset exactly the same. So I'll just stick a pin in those. So that's what your skinny strips will look like. All right, so now we will do the fat. Same process, except we're going to use our 60-degree angle. So I'm going to place my background strip face up. I'm going to find my 60-degree angle, place it down the raw edge, and then I'm just going to move this up to where it intersects on the left-hand side so it is below the selvage. Take my 0.1 strip, face down, right? We want right sides together. I'm going to stick that selvage just above where the ruler intersects, where I'm going to sew. Just going to hold it there, move that ruler out of the way, and stick a pin in there. Okay, so I've got my strips all offset. So again, I have two for the skinny, but just one for the fat. The reason it takes more for the skinny is because the angle is more severe. You get less units when you cut them out at the angle. So that's why for this particular block, you need two strip sets for the skinny, but just one for the fat. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew these using my nice true 1/4 inch seam. When we get back, I will show you what I mean exactly by my true 1/4 inch seam, so you'll know what seam to use moving forward. So next video, we'll show you the seam. Okay, I've gotten my seam sewn, and I just wanted to take a second to show you how I make sure I'm doing a true 1/4 inch seam. And before I do that, the good news here is these first seams that you sew with your background in your 0.1, you can use this as a test seam. So this first seam actually has no bearing on your block. So I'm going to measure now, but even if I was off a little bit one way or the other, I wouldn't need to take this out. But moving forward, I would want to adjust. So let's talk about that true 1/4 inch seam. So how I check is I just take my regular straight edge ruler and I put my 1/4 inch line down the seam. When I have the 1/4 inch line right down the thread line, the ruler should be flush with the side of the strip set. So there shouldn't be any fabric hanging out. If there is, your seam is too wide. If you can see some daylight between the edge of the ruler and the edge of the fabric, then your seam is too scant. So I really feel like you will be more successful in getting your block to size, right, so that it's slightly under 14 inches if you sew this true 1/4 inch seam. So same thing for the fat. I'm just going to stick that 1/4 inch line down the seam line, and it should be flush with the edge of the ruler. So moving forward, once you get that sort of dialed in, that's where you want to sew. You want to make sure you always keep your edges together, and you want to try and sew, as straight as you can. So when we come back, we will talk about how we're going to get these strip sets pressed. Okay, so now we are ready to press our strip set. So we're on step 4. I'm going to start again with the skinny. I've already pressed one of my strip sets, but we're just going to talk about how we want to get these pressed. So the good news with my method for making mariner's compasses is we're always going to press in the same manner. I'm always going to set you up to press up and away. And let me explain what I mean by that. So it's going to tell you that you want to press your seam toward the background strip. So that's towards the wider strip, right? Of course, we do not want to press on the back and do this because I see this happen in class sometimes. And then when people turn it over, you get a lip here, right? I'm exaggerating. You wouldn't get that much. But I see that people don't get a lip. We want this to be totally up and away so that the seam is pointing up and so that that seam is totally open. So to do that, you're going to put your point one, the narrower strip on the bottom with the background strip on the top. And you're going to go ahead and set your seam. I really think it's a good idea to set your seams. Remember, we're working with a dry iron. We don't want to add moisture to our strip sets, even though at this point we're working from straight of grain to straight of grain, but it's just a good idea to use a dry iron. Then we're just going to come in here and we're going to press up and away. And when we press up and away, when I get to that seam, you'll feel it. Your iron, when it hits where the seam is, there's kind of a ridge that is formed by that seam. So when you're pushing your iron up and away, you are making sure that that seam is totally open, that you're not having a lip and laying flat. And you're just going to go down and press that whole strip set. So I've already done it here for the other one, so I'm just going to show you. So when I turn it over, this is what it should look like. So your point one strip should be toward the background. You shouldn't have any fishtailing, right? So it should all be going in one direction and laying flat. So don't be afraid to turn up the heat on your iron, especially since you're using a dry iron. All right, I'm just going to set this aside for a second, and I'm going to bring out the fat. So again, step 4, same thing, nothing different here, but I'll just show you what it looks like. So again, we're going to put that narrower point one strip underneath. We're going to set our seam, and then we're going to come back and press up and away. And you want to make sure, right, we want to keep this strip straight as we're going along. We don't want to press it into an S. So I can just feel that lip. I'm just hitting that little ridge and it's getting nice and open and flat and going down the whole strip set. So let me just finish this here really quickly and I can turn it over and show you. So again, up and away. So now when I turn this over, the seam is not fishtailing, got one little thing here, so good idea at this point. Now I can go ahead and just press that nice and flat. So make sure it looks good before we come back and move forward. So when we get back, we'll turn the page and we'll be moving on to steps 5 and beyond. All right, so we've turned the page to page 5. And we are going to start with step 5. So basically, the steps on this page are for cutting these angled units. And we need to cut 8 angled units out of our strip set or strip sets for our blocks. So I'm just going to walk you through these next steps. Down at the bottom, important, it says cutting accurate angle units is the key to making these blocks. So if you're careful to get these angled units cut accurately and correctly, then the rest of your block is going to go together easily. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to set the angle for both our skinny and our fat strip sets. So the first thing you're going to want to do, and I'm just going to push these up here out of the way, is get your strip set with the background strip at the top. So here's our skinny and here's our fat. So you want to just get them laid out so that you've got, again, the wider strip at the top. Now, for skinny, we are going to use a 45-degree angle. Now, if you're using my angle ruler, I'm going to give you a little tip here. If you look for the logo on the ruler, and you can see the logo on my ruler, you can sort of use that so to get the ruler oriented. It'll be a little bit easier for you to find your angle. Okay, so I've got the logo at the top. I find the 45-degree angle, and I want to put that down the seam line. All right. You want to put it on the seam as opposed to on the edges because you'll get more accurate units this way, okay? So I want the 45-degree line to be on the seam, and then I want the edge of the ruler just to be to the left of those selvages. Remember, we offset and we wanted to end up cutting those selvages off, so I'm just going to come to the left so I make sure and get both of those selvages cut off. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. So for the skinny, again, it's at a 45-degree angle. So that's what it's going to look like. For the fat, it's a 60-degree angle. So same process, but we're going to put the 60 down the seam. Make sure we're just to the left of both selvages, and once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. Okay, whoops, didn't quite get that cut. All right, so now we've got our skinny and we've got our fat. If you go to the book, now we've done steps 5 and 6, we've set the angle. Step 7, we're going to flip the strip sets around, and now is where we're going to start cutting those angled units. All right, so I'm going to flip this around. That's the skinny, and that's the fat. All right, I'm going to take my angle ruler. We'll start with the skinny again, and I'm going to put the ruler oriented exactly how I had it before with the 45-degree angle down the seam, okay? Because again, that's going to give us more accurate units. And then we're going to cut these units apart. But you have to stop for a second and ask yourself, how wide? Where do I cut those units? If you read your book, step 7, in the bold italics, it says, always cut the units apart the same width as you cut your background fabric, okay? So what did we cut our background strip? We cut it 4 inches. So we cut it 4 inches for both the skinny and the fat. So it'll be easy for you to remember no matter which block you're making. So to figure out the 4 inches, right, we need to come over. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 inches, and I have the 45-degree line down the seam. Now, because I just set that angle, both of those should line up perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and make that first cut. All right, just going to set this aside so it doesn't fall off. All right, I'm going to start a nice, neat pile over here of units. So I'm just going to come down my strip set, right? I'm going to put that 45-degree line on the seam. This is still lining up beautifully, and I will go ahead and cut that next unit. Now, if we make a nice neat pile, right, now we know that those units are the same. If they're not, right, you'll know right away, because you don't want to find out 2 or 3 steps down that you've cut one the wrong width. All right, so I just continue down. Sometimes what happens when you get to the middle of your strip set, because we tend to cut our strips on the fold, what will happen is when you put the 45-degree on the seam, that it doesn't line up here as well anymore. Or if it's lined up here, it's not lining up on your seam line. So this is common, this happens a lot, it's nothing to worry about, but we want accurate units. So to adjust this, we're just simply going to turn that strip set around. We're going to put that 45-degree angle on the seam, and we're going to retrim. And I don't really need to retrim here. I was still pretty straight. It could be off just a tidge, but a lot of times you're just gonna trim off a sliver. But by doing that little sliver, it's going to help get your unit back to the correct angle. So now when I put my ruler back on here, everything is going to line up perfectly. All right, so I'm just going to continue cutting until I get 8 units. And remember, you'll need both strips to be able to get those 8 units. So once you finish with this strip and get as many as you can, then you'll set the angle for the second strip, turn around and cut the units needed to get 8. Okay, for the fat, same process. We're going to put the 60-degree angle down the seam 4 inches because that's what we cut the background strip. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Got those both lined up. Make that cut. And again, make our nice, neat pile. So you can see the difference, what the skinny and the fat look like, and it's just based on the angle, but the method for cutting the units is exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all 8 units, and then we'll come back and move on from there. Okay, we've got our 8 units, our 8 angled units cut, got our nice neat pile, so we know that they're all accurate. So now we're going to move on to page 6. If you look at the top of page 6, you'll see there is kind of an overview. This is just showing you, basically, we're going to take these angled units, chop them up a little bit, and then we're going to turn them into these pie units in the next steps. But we're going to kind of break it down into smaller steps, just one step at a time. And the first step is just cutting off what I call these background triangles. So I'll start with the skinny first. And again, you just want to have your book open, and if you get it oriented, everything, so it looks like the book, it'll be a lot easier for you when you go to do the cutting for this step. So basically, I'm going to take my whole pile, set it here, and I'm going to orient the pile the same way that it looks like here in the book, and just bring one unit down at a time. And then I'm going to put my straight edge ruler, it doesn't have to be my ruler, but any straight edge ruler, basically on the left-hand side of the unit, because we're going to cut off this background triangle. Now, instead of just cutting from this corner up to this point, we need to take into account this seam allowance. So to do that, we're going to leave the edge of the ruler right on this bottom point, but I'm going to slide the top of the ruler so that my 1/4 inch line is at the top of the seam. So edge of the ruler on the bottom point, 1/4 inch line at the top of the seam. And again, by doing this, by sliding it over and taking the seam allowance into account, that's going to make these two sides of the triangle more the same. If I just did it like this, you can see that side is going to be shorter. All right, so I get it lined up, and I'm going to go ahead and make this cut. When I make that cut, I want you to notice, so I did cut into the 0.1 a little bit, and then on this background triangle, you can see there's a little tiny triangle here. That means that I did it correctly. So I'm just going to start a pile of those. Again, 2 nice, neat piles. Bring my next unit over and continue on. So edge of the ruler on the point, 1/4 inch line at the top of the seam. All right, so I'll just continue with those. Now for the fat, same thing. Get my pile oriented. Bring 1 unit down at a time. Get my ruler on this side of the unit, edge of the ruler on the bottom point, 1/4 inch line at the top of the seam. This is going to make these sides more the same. So for a fat, you're going to get actually more of an equilateral triangle, which means all three sides are pretty much the same. So I'll make that cut so you can see. So you can see I cut into the 0.1 a little bit and I get this little tiny triangle. So I'm going to make my two little nice neat piles here. Bring the next one down. All right, and here is a little tip for you. Instead of using my ankle ruler, you can actually use your fat ruler, or if you were doing skinny, you can use your skinny ruler, whichever you have handy. What I'm going to look for is just this line that comes down the edge of either kite B or kite A. That solid line is 1/4 inch from the edge. So I'm not really using the ruler for its purposes. I'm just using that 1/4 inch line. And the reason I show this is because sometimes it's easier for folks to see. So again, I'm going to put the edge of the ruler, the bottom point, and then I'm going to put that solid 1/4 inch line there right at the top of the seam. And you can see it might be a little bit easier for you to see. So that's all you're going to do in this step is go in and you're going to cut off all of the background triangles. So you'll have 8 of these units and 8 background triangles when we come back. Okay, we've got all the background triangles cut off. We'll go ahead and turn the page. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make 2 cuts on each of these units using either the skinny robin or the fat robin ruler, depending on which block you're making. So I'm going to go ahead and just set these background triangles aside for a minute. We will be using them in the next steps, but for now we're just going to be working with these units. And so I would recommend just getting them again, the whole pile set up like it looks in the book. And then we're just going to bring 1 unit down at a time to make the cuts. All right, so before we get started making the cuts, let's talk about these rulers for a minute. So we have our skinny robin here on the left and the fat robin on the right. So obvious because the skinny and the fat is chubbier. So a few things to know about my rulers. And if you go back to page 3 in your book, I do talk more about the rulers there. So the information is in the book. The first thing to know is that solid lines go on seam lines, dashed lines go on raw edges. So that's just something to know about my rulers. There are 2 kites on each ruler. So I call them kites for obvious reasons because I think they kind of are shaped like kites. So there's a kite A and a kite B. And I'm always going to tell you in the book which kite that you are using. So we're actually, for these first 2 cuts, we are going to be using kite B. We are going to make 2 cuts on each unit before we go on to the next. So we're not going to go and make the first cut on all 8 and come back and make the second. We're going to make both cuts. I think it's easier and takes less brain work in the long run if you do it this way. So bear with me, try it this way, and I think you'll see there's kind of a muscle memory thing that happens when you are using the ruler in this manner. The 2 cuts I have named, so I have little names that'll kind of help you through. The first cut is called left and low, and the second cut is called high and right. So as you're looking at kite B sitting in front of you, move this over so we can see our kite Bs. When I say left and low, it means let's look left and low on our rulers. You'll see a series of numbers down there for all the 16 sizes you can make with my ruler. We're making a 14-inch block, so you're going to find your 14 number down there, and you will see that it's sitting on a solid line. And remember, solid lines go on seam lines, so just keep that in your brain for a second. For the left and low cut, not only will we be looking at that line, but we're also going to be looking at this line that defines the bottom, the left and low bottom of the kite, that dashed line. And remember, dashed lines go on raw edges. So that's what we'll be paying attention to for left and low. High and right, then we're going to be looking on the right-hand side of the kite. There is a divider line that divides the kite into two, right? Solid lines and dashed lines. That solid line is the only line that doesn't follow the rule, right? That line does not ever go on a seam line. It's just dividing the kite in two. So high and right, we're going to find our 14, right? But we're looking this time for the dashed line that corresponds to the 14. And it's going to be the dashed line that is below the 14. The way I know this is if I look up at the 6, the dashed line is below the 6, therefore it's always going to be the line below. So it's going to be that dashed line below the 14. So we'll be using that line as a point of reference. We'll be using this middle line as a point of reference just to put on the bottom point of our unit. And then the other line we'll be using is the side of the kite. That's a solid line side of the kite. That will go on a seam. I want to also explain to you there are some numbers that go down that line. For a compass sunflower, we do not use those numbers. So you do not have to worry about matching anything to these numbers, and you should not try to match anything to these numbers. We're only going to do the left and low and the high and right. All right, so that's an overview. Let's put the ruler into action. So I get my first unit. I say to myself, left and low. I find my 14, the solid line, and I'm going to put that on the seam line. So now my 14 is on the seam line. The dashed line that forms the bottom of the kite, I'm simply going to pull that down to the raw edge. Now when you pull the ruler down or up or however you're adjusting, make sure you don't pull that 14 off of the seam, okay? So before I make the cut that I'm going to make now, I want to make sure the 14's on the seam, the dashed line is on the raw edge. And then I'm going to make this low cut. All right, I'm going to leave that little piece right there as a reference point for just a second because that's where I'm going to slide the ruler to. So now I'm doing the high and right. I'm going to look at the 14. I'm going to find that dashed line that's below the 14. I'm just going to put my index finger right under that line for a second. And I'm going to slide the ruler straight down. As I slide it, I want to keep the center line of the kite on this bottom point. And I'm going to keep sliding until that dashed 14 line hits where I just cut that piece off. Do you see that? The middle line should be on the point, and then the side of the kite should be on the seam. So you just need to make some little micro adjustments to make sure all three of those are where they belong. I find in my classes, people kind of get a death grip on their rulers. So just loosen your grip and just kind of jiggle joggle the ruler around until you get those three lines lined up. Once you're happy, then we're going to make this right hand cut. When I make that cut, I want you to note that we did indeed cut into the background, and you shouldn't worry about that. What that is doing is later on when we sew the units together, that's what gives us that extra room, right, out on the perimeter of the block when we get ready to finish it. So these two pieces will be waste. I'll set those aside. Let me do one more unit quickly and then we'll go and do the fat. So left and low, I find my 14, I put it on the seam line. Then I'm going to pull the ruler down so the dashed line is on the raw edge. When I've got both lined up, That's my first cut. High and right, I bring that ruler straight down until that dashed line below the 14 hits where I just cut. Make sure the side of the kite is on the seam, center line on the bottom point. Now, if you can't get that second cut to line up, my best tip for you is to go back and check the first cut. Sometimes if you don't make that first, well, I know if you don't make that first cut right, the second cut won't line up. So a lot of times if you go back and remeasure for the first one and get that accurate, the second one will come into play. All right, so that is skinny. Same thing for fat. Bring my unit. So I find my 14 left and low. Find that solid line and it goes on the seam line. Then the dashed line that forms the bottom of the kite goes on the raw edge. So when I'm happy, then I'm going to make this low cut. Again, I'm going to leave that piece there for a second. I'm going to find the dashed line that's below the 14. I'm going to bring the ruler straight down, keeping that center line on the point until the 14 hits there where I just cut off. The side of the kite needs to go on the seam, and that middle line goes on the point. That's your second cut. Again, we cut into the background. That's going to give us the room beyond the points later for finishing. Okay, we'll do one more here. So bring our unit down, left and low. I find my 14, solid line goes on the seam line, dashed line comes down to the raw edge. Make the low cut. Now high and right, find my 14 dashed line, bring the ruler straight down till that dashed line hits, side of the kite on the seam, middle line on the point. So now you're just going to continue on making those two cuts to all 8 of your units. And the first couple times that you make these cuts, yes, you're going to have to use your brain a little bit. You're going to have to think it through, but I promise that it will get easier as you go along. Again, that kind of muscle memory thing of sliding the ruler down, it really will take you less time in the end if you make both cuts on each unit. All right, we've got all of our units trimmed, the skinnies here and the fats here. So at the bottom of page 7, it says you should have 8 shaped units. Now we're moving on to page 8, step 12. So we're going to grab those reserve triangles that we set aside for a minute because as you can see, these are going to get sewn back on to make our pie units. So in step 12, all you're going to do there is remember those little tiny triangles, we just need to pull those off. So you don't, excuse me, need to get even a seam ripper out. I'm just going to grab that and pull, and you are going to get a little tab that kind of folds out there. A little tip for you, if you don't get a tab, it means you pressed that first seam the wrong way. It means you pressed it toward the 0.1 strip. So if you don't have a tab, you might want to take a minute and make sure you get those seams pressed in the correct direction. So as you're pulling these triangles off, just make sure you keep those triangles all oriented in the same direction. Same for the fat, so keep all the tabs together. Now, in step 13, we're going to set ourselves up to sew the background triangles to the unit. So I'm going to lay out my units the way that it looks in step 13. So we're going to place the trimmed units face down and the background triangles face up with that tab to the bottom right. Same thing here for the fat, okay? Right side down, right side up. You'll see this little arrow. So basically what we're going to do, and I'm going to move my pile over, and I'm just going to bring one down at a time. We're going to cross this over, right, and sew this seam. So when we're done, we're going to have our pie unit. But we want to take a little care here because when our pie is done, we want it to be, it's already flush on this side, but we want it to be flush on the other side. So I actually sewed one up so that I can show you what I mean. So see, this side is already flush, but when we sew this side on, we want it to be flush over here when we're done as well. So to do that, when you cross these over, you're going to get a V or a ditch here that's created between the background triangle and your trimmed unit. The bottom of that V needs to be a 1/4 inch over from the raw edge. So if you look in your book, I'm doing the skinny first here, there's a little box and it's showing you how you can use a straight edge ruler to get that lined up. So when you put your 1/4 inch line down the raw edge, the edge of the ruler should be right in the middle of that V because that is mimicking where we're going to sew. And you can actually put a little pressure on your ruler, just make a little check here, right? So when we sew that, you can see that it's going to be flush. Now I'm going to exaggerate here because sometimes people have a little trouble with this. So if the V is too far over and I sew my 1/4 inch seam, right, I'm going to get a jog there. Or if my V is not down far enough, same thing, right, I'm going to get this jog. So it's important to find where that V is. So I just place my ruler on there. I've got it where I want. I'm just going to stick a pin in there. And now let's measure for the fat, and then I'll talk about how we're going to sew these. So same thing, bring 2 down at a time, and again, you want that tab down towards the bottom. So what's important about the way I have these oriented is because I'm now putting you back, when you sew this side is going to be on the straight of grain for both of them. So I'm just helping you to keep your block more stable. So you want that tab to be, that's where you're going to sew to. Same thing. So I want to make sure, and I can kind of do my sanity check here. Make sure those edges are together. And as long as that V is right there in the, where the 1/4 inch is, you are good to go. So I put a pin there. Now the sewing, and I've actually just already sewn a couple so I can show you quickly here. So you're going to start sewing from the top down. And I'm going to recommend that you put your machine in the needle down position. So your needle is down, you slide that V up to the needle. When you put your presser foot down, it should be exactly where it's supposed to be, right, for your true 1/4 inch seam. Then you're going to sew. You're going to keep your edges together, sew your true 1/4 inch seam. And down at the bottom here, remember, we're not going to try to match anything because this is the outside of the block, the Las Vegas part of the block, so we don't have to worry about matching anything. What I do find in my classes is as people are sewing down to the bottom here, their seams tend to get scanter as they get toward the end. Make sure that you maintain that 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Again, not worrying about matching anything. The only place you have to worry about is getting that 1/4 inch seam in the ditch. And then at the bottom of page 8, it's going to talk about the pressing. So I'm going to just do a quick little press demo here for these 2 that I've sewn. Again, we have our press as you go instructions. So let me just stick this up here so I don't have to change gears and go over to my other pressing board. If you set your units up the way that it looks in the book, so you're going to put that background triangle on the top and you want your unit facing toward the right. So this is what it should look like. Then we're going to wing out. So that's another little saying I have. But remember in the beginning, I told you we're always going to press up and away. So I'm always setting you up to press up and away. I'm setting my seams, and now I'm going to press this up and away. But I want to be very careful. Again, no steam, right? No moisture, because this is where you can start stretching your units out. When you go to press this up, you feel that ridge. You want the iron just to go over the seam and stop, and then just hold it there 3, 4, 5 seconds. We just want to make sure that seam is going in the proper direction and laying flat. We don't want to iron out on that triangle because you'll tend to stretch it out. So we're just pressing that seam. So we'll do the same thing for the skinny here. Up and away, and I'm just stopping my iron just over the seam and holding it there. Again, we're just pressing. Now, when you turn these pie units over, you will see they're laying nice and flat, and you'll see there's a stitching X at the top of your point ones. And you should see that your seams are nice and consistent, nice 1/4 inch seams on both sides. So this is what your pie units should look like at the end of step 15, and you will have 8 pies to move forward with. Okay, I've got my 8 pies made. A couple other just quick things before we move on. So I didn't say, but you can chain stitch these together once you get them pinned, and you can just sew chain stitch them all together. And then the other thing, once you have your 8 pies, make sure, turn them all over, make sure that they all have those seams going in the proper direction, that you maintained that 1/4 inch seam, because that seam that you make determines where your point comes out. So if you haven't maintained the 1/4 inch seam and you got scant down here, your point's going to end up being too long. So you just want to give those a double check so that those are good moving forward. All right, so we're at the bottom of page 8. We've made our 8 pies. We're to our sticky notes. So I'm going to just stick those down there, and I'm going to go back now to where we were. So we went through steps 9 through 15. So I'll pull that off, and we'll go ahead and turn the pages. So now we are on page 3, and it again is going to refer us back. It's going to refer us back to the Mariner's Compass steps 16 through 21. And then there's a big except that says do not reserve 4 pies. Instead, sew all 8 pies onto the point 2 strip and then continue through step 21, shaping all 8 units. So what we're going to do is go back and follow the steps to make 8 of these. So I'm going to put my sticky note right under there again. I'm going to go back to the Mariner's Compass chapter. So we did 15. So basically we're just turning the page where we were, right? So now we're on page 9 in the first chapter, and we're going to go from step 16 through 21. Okay, so I'm going to put my sticky note here so that I know when I get here that I will go back. All right, so this step 16 is really just an offsetting step. So if you look down in step 17, you see there's a little room that's left at the top of the strip. We need to leave a little room because later when we cut these units at an angle, we need to have enough fabric that's left there at the top. So this is really a simple thing to do. I will start with the skinny, and we do have 2 strips because you're not going to get all 8 strips on one. So I'm going to lay my point 2 strip face up with the selvage up here. I'm going to take one of my pie units and I'm going to lay it face down, flush on the side that I'm not sewing, and so that the point is below the selvage, okay? Now, where this angles across, I'm just going to stick my thumb there for a second, and then all I'm going to do is rotate that pie, and so that I'm below my thumb. And you can give yourself, you know, 1/8 of an inch or so below that. Just make sure you're leaving enough room here at the top of the strip. So I'm going to go ahead and put one on here. Let's do one of the backs, and then I'll come back and talk about the sewing. All right, so same thing. I've got my 0.2 strip. I'm going to lay my pie unit face down, flush over here. Where it angles over, I just stick my finger there and then rotate the pie, give myself a little room, and stick a pin in there. All right, so we're going to place these units about 1/4 inch apart. It says that in the book. So let me just put this up. So you don't have to pin these on. I'm just going to take the pile with me. When I get to the bottom of this one, again, keeping your edges together, sewing your true 1/4 inch seam. Once I sew this one on, I just grab from the pile and then continue adding them on. Really important that you get these going in the proper direction. So this would not be correct, right? You want to make sure they're all facing and looking like it says in the book. Now remember it said, because in the book here it's going to tell you just to reserve 4 pies. But we're not going to do that because remember it said we're going to use all 8 pies. We want to sew all 8 onto these strips. So same thing here, you just put them about 1/4 inch apart. So before I go to my machine, I would just take my second strip and go ahead and put another one at the top because we know we're at least going to put one on there. So that one will be ready. So when you grab your second strip, you've got a pie on there and then you just add as many as you need. So I've got them both ready to go. Do this one quickly. So again, flush on the left-hand side, point below the selvage, rotate, give yourself a little bit of room and pin that on. So I'm going to go now and just sew all of my 8 pies onto my 2.2 strips and then we'll come back and press. Okay, I've got all the pies sewn on, the fat and the skinny here. And now we are on step 18, where we are just going to do this pressing step. So I'm going to demo this. I'm going to move the books out of the way for a second so that you can see what I am doing. So as you can see, I got 7 of the fat on one strip and 1 on the other. So I'm just going to set this one aside for a second so you can see easier. And then the skinny, I got 6 on one strip and 2 on the other. So I'll just set that aside for a second. All right, so you want to set this up the way it looks in the book so that your 0.2 strip is facing up and your pies are facing in the direction that you see here, because we want to press these up and away, right? We always want to press up and away. So to do that, you're going to set your seam. I'll just do a couple here. And we're going to, just like we did before when we made pie, we're going to wing out. We're going to press up and away, and we want to, hit that little ridge, that seam, and we're just going to get the iron over the seam and stop. Remember, we don't want to iron out on the pie because we don't want to stretch it out. And don't be afraid just to leave your iron down on there for a minute so that that seam is laying nice and flat and going in the proper direction. I'll do one more here. And then I'll turn it over so you can see what it looks like on the back. Right, so that seam should be going toward the pie, laying flat and going toward the pie. There are some dog ears that are on those pies. You're welcome to clip those if you want. I leave them, but some people don't like to have those little dog ears there, so you can trim those if you would like. So I would just finish going down this strip, and then I would do the other fat strip that I set aside. And then the same thing for the skinny. I'll just do a couple here so that you can see what that's supposed to look like. But again, we're just pressing up and away. We're just getting that seam pressed up and laying flat, going in the proper direction and not ironing out on the pie. Okay, so I'll turn that over so you can see. Those should be going up and away, and I've got a little kind of push that seam, so I'm just going to fix that really quick. So again, it's good to turn things over and see what they look like on the back. Sometimes you can inadvertently, press the seam in the wrong direction. So just make sure things are staying in the proper direction as you go. So I'm going to go ahead and get these pressed, and then we're going to come back and do a little more cutting. Okay, I've got them all pressed, and so now we are on step 19 in your book on page 9. And basically what we're going to do here in this next step is we're just going to cut these units apart to make 8 of the units that you see there at the bottom of the page. So you just are going to need a straight edge ruler. I'm going to start here with the skinny, so I'm going to move the fat out of the way. And I just grab my straight edge ruler, and let me move this down a little bit so you can see the end. So as you're looking at your book, we are right here. So all we're going to do is basically cut the 0.2 strip. We're not going to do anything to the pies. We're only going to cut the 0.2 strip. It says never trim the pies, and I'll explain that here as we go. So there's going to be 2 ways that you can cut these apart. The first one that it's showing is if you do not have my angle ruler. So because we are going to use some different angles that aren't found on any straight edge ruler in the second illustration. So if you don't have my angle ruler, you're going to continue on. We're doing skinny with that 45-degree angle, and you're going to place it on this seam line. So pay attention to where the arrow is pointing, and then you should be pretty much flush with the side of pie. And then you would just come in here and make this cut. Now, if you do have my angle ruler, you're going to use the 67.5-degree angle, and you're going to place it on this seam. I think it makes it just ever so slightly a little more accurate. All right, so you get up there nice and close. What may happen is as you're going down your strip set, sometimes you may see, like here when I use my 67.5, my pie is hanging out just a tidge, but again, I would not trim it. That is a function of how I pressed. So you really don't want to see the pies hanging out a whole bunch. That might mean I overpress this one a little bit. Let's just go to the next one and see what that looks like. So most of the time, this is what it will look like. And it may be hard to see here, but my pie is just slightly less than flush. And again, it's a function of the pressing, and that means I'm not over pressing. So as you can see, it's probably going to be for each one just a tinge different based on how I pressed. But what we want to count on is this angle that we're using here to line up to keep this angle consistent moving down. So again, if you've got my angle ruler, that is the angle that you would use. And you're just going to go down your strip set again, put this down the seam, flush with this side, and you're just cutting on the right-hand side of pie. If you're using the 45-degree angle, it's really the same thing. It's just going to be a little more accurate with the 67.5 because we're at the seam closest to where we're cutting. But I'm not worried about cutting with that angle either. When I first had this book for the first year and a half, this angle ruler didn't exist. So that's how they were cut. All right, so I've got a few cut. You're just going to make your nice neat pile, and that's how the skinny is going to look. Let's look at the fat. Grab my strip set here, grab my book. Same thing, okay, except we are working, if you don't have my angle ruler, with the 60-degree angle. So make sure you get things nice and straight. I always like to kind of line up my strip along a line on my cutting mat just to make sure things are nice and straight. That 60-degree angle would be on this seam, right? And you would be nice and flush. You can see I'm a little less than flush here. We're not going to worry about this. We're only going to worry about getting that angle set. If you do have my angle ruler, you're going to use the 82.5 degree angle, and you're going to lay that down this seam up flush, and you're just going to come down and continue to cut. One little tip here with the fat, as you're looking at the ruler, so there's 82.5 here. This is the one you're going to use. There's another 82.5 on the other side of the 90, but if I try to line that up, right, that isn't even close to where it should be. So just caution, I have seen people do that in class where they've made that cut instead of the proper one, which would look like this, right? You should pretty much be flush with the pie. So I'm just going to get these all cut apart, and then we'll come back and we're going to use your either skinny robin or fat robin ruler again to make the next cuts. Okay, I've got my units cut apart, and so I should have 8 units, and then the couple that were on the other strip, you'll have 1 unit left that's got a big long tail, right? So don't worry about that tail. It's going to take care of itself in the next step. So same with the fat. We've got one, that's got a big long tail. So no worries there. So what we're going to do now, so at the bottom of page 9, it says we've got our fat robin, our units, and you should have 8. It says 4 here, remember, but we did 8 pies, so we're going to have 8 of these units. Now we're going to move on to the next page. So 20 and 21 is we're going to make 2 cuts with our rulers again, and then we're going to use the same exact method as we did to make those first cuts, except instead of using kite B, we're going to now use kite A, but we're going to make those 2 cuts in the same manner. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to move this one out of the way for a second, and then I'll show you on the second cut, we'll use that one so you can see how that tail goes away. All right, so same process. We're going to do left and low, high and right. So we're again making a 14-inch block, so we know it's going to be this line here, and it's going to be the dash line below the 14 here. So move this up out of the way a little bit. So left and low, I put the 14-inch solid line on the 0.2 seam, right? So the seam of the strip we just added. And then the dashed line should come right down and line up with the raw edge. Now, if you made those last cuts and you didn't have my angle ruler, sometimes what will happen is when you get the 14 on the seam line, this might not line up perfectly. Do not worry about it. The key here is make sure that 14 stays down the seam and ends right at the bottom of the seam. And then what you might see is maybe the dash line is a little below on one side and a little above on the other, or vice versa. It will all come out in the wash, I promise, so don't worry a second about it, but just know sometimes that happens. So make sure the 14 is on the seam, down to the bottom there, raw edge, dash line hopefully is lining up, and then you're going to make the low cut. Second cut, high and right. So we're going to put our index finger here right under that 14. And again, we're going to bring the ruler straight down until that dash line hits where we just cut. Then we're going to make our little jiggle joggle so we get the side of the kite on the seam, and the middle line should be on the bottom point. And that is your second cut. So those are the cuts you're going to make, right, to make your 8 units. So let's do one with the one that has the tail, so you can just see that that tail is going to go right away. So left and low, put the 14 on the seam line, dash line on the raw edge, high and right, bring this 14 down. When that hits, side of the kite on the seam, center line on the point, and that's our second cut, and there goes the tail. So you can just put that strip away to make more compasses or for another project. All right, so that's skinny. Let's look at fat. Bring one of these guys over. So we'll get our fat ruler. Again, kite A, left and low. We're going to put that 14 on the seam line, dashed line on the raw edge. Make sure that 14 is on the seam all the way down to the raw edge, and make that low cut. High and right, we're going to find our 14. It's that dashed line right under the 14. Pull the ruler down. So that should be on the raw edge, side of the kite on the seam, center line on the point, and that is your second cut. All right, so let's do the one with the tail. So you can see what that looks like. Left and low, 14 on the seam, dashed line on the raw edge. So nothing new here. So you can see once you learn those two cuts, life gets a lot easier, and it just takes a minute. Again, that sort of muscle memory thing, pulling the ruler down, making sure now we've got the dash line, side of the kite on the seam, just jiggle joggling till we have all three lined up. That tail goes away for another project or more compasses. So now I'm just going to continue to the end of page 10, and I will have 8 of these units. All right, so we've got them all trimmed. We've got 8 of these units. We're to our sticky notes. So I'll pull that off, and now we're going to go back to where we left off. All right, so we are here where it says you should have 8 of these shaped units, and yes, indeed we do. And so I'm going to pull this sticky note off, and now we don't have to go back and forth anymore. We're just going to follow the rest of the instructions from here on out to get our raw blocks that you can see at the bottom of page 4. All right, so we're going to move on to step 6. Basically, we're going to now sew these units onto our inside 0.3 strip. And to do that, we don't really have to do any offsetting or anything. You just want to make sure you get these going on in the proper direction. So they're just going to put that small end, and I would just give yourself a little room below the selvage. It's going to tell you to put them about 1/4 inch apart. If this is your first block, I would just give a little more room in between. It'll just make it easier in the next step when you cut them apart. So again, I don't pin these all on before I go. You can if you want. I just pin that first one on so I know I've got it going in the right direction, and then I take the whole pile to my sewing machine and just sew them on one after the other. So same thing here, right? You just want to give yourself a little bit of room. I'm going to go ahead and pin that one on, and then I'll take my pile. But you're just going to sew them on, and again, this is your first block. You can leave a little more than 1/4 inch in between 3/8 up to 1/2. You have this whole strip to get your 8 units on, so you've got plenty of room. You just don't want to be too wasteful in between. So all I'm going to do now is go to my sewing machine, again, using my true 1/4 inch seam, keeping my edges nice together. I'm going to sew all 8 units onto each strip. All right, so I've got my skinny and my fat sewn on here, like it looks like in step 7. And so now we are on step 8, and we're just going to press these. The pressing is the same for the skinny and the fat. So I'm just going to move these books out of the way so I can show you the pressing. So after they're sewn, I try to kind of keep them in that little same order that you sewed them on. And you're going to just lay them down your pressing board and try to get your strip to be in a nice straight line, okay? And then just like we've done before, you're going to set those seams, and we're obviously going to press up and away. Now, these are on the bias here. So when you go up, right, there's some play here. You want to just be careful that you're just pressing on that ridge, getting your iron over the seam and just holding it there and not, you don't want those to be flopping one way or the other. And I just come down, just bring one up at a time, just keep my iron down. Excuse me, on the strip set and continue down. All right, one more. All right, and then I'm just going to take this strip, I'm going to set it aside, and I do try to kind of keep it in order, so I just kind of pick it up like this, and I'm going to set it over here on my cutting table, which we will do next. So same thing for the fat. Right, try to keep things nice and neat. Set our seams. Oops. Oh, got that a little bit wonked out. There we go. All right, and then we just come in and press these up. So I'm just going to get these both pressed well. And then we will go back to the cutting board and we're going to cut these units apart. Once we get them cut apart, we'll make one more cut and then we just sew these 8 units together. So we're almost there. Okay, we've got them pressed. I'm going to start here with the demo for step 9 with the skinny. So basically now what we're going to do is we're going to cut these units apart so that we have 8 units. And then in step 10, we're going to take those units, flip them around, make one more cut, and then we will have these 8 units that we will just sew together to make our block on the next page. So again, if you've got my angle ruler, always do the way that it shows with my angle ruler. I'll explain as we go here. If you don't, then you'll use the other illustration. So I'll start with that. So if you don't have my angle ruler, you're going to use your skinny robin ruler, kite, and it doesn't matter. You don't have to use the 14 line. I'm going to actually choose the longest line that I can down here that I could still make a full cut of this inside point 3 strip. So what you want to do is get this lined up on the seam as far as you can down. And again, you're just going to cut that 0.2 strip. Now, if you look up here, you're going to see these are going to have a lot of play because they're on the bias. So you don't really have to worry about matching, making sure that they're flush, as long as they're laying pretty darn flat and that you're using this line as a measurement, okay? So again, I put that line on there, flush with this side, and I would just make that cut. Now, if you have my angle ruler, we're going to use that 67.5 degree line. And the reason I like using my ruler is because that line is longer. So if I get it all the way as far as I can down the seam line, I know I'm going to be really accurate with this angled cut. So I just start there, and again, I've got a strip that I can use in another project or for more compasses. Then I just slide down and get flush and go into the next one. Now you want to be careful that you don't cut into that unit. That's why I had you leave them a little further apart for when you sewed them on. So just to make this a little bit easier, okay? So we're just gonna put those all over there and we would just finish cutting all 8 of these units. Okay, let me show you for the fat. Same exact process. So we'll get this. And you do want to make sure you get your strip nice and straight, right? And then just take a minute to get these all standing up nice and straight, okay? And as flat as possible. So just take a minute. If you do that, it'll just make the cutting easier, right? Okay, so if you don't have my angle ruler, right, you're going to use your fat robin ruler. Again, you're going to choose the longest line that you can down the seam, and you would make that cut. If you have my angle ruler, you're going to use that 82.5, right? So again, get that down the seam as far as you can. That is going to make sure that this angle gets set correctly. So you can see that pie, or that unit, it's not a pie, that unit is actually sticking out a little bit. You can take a minute to put it back a little bit, but again, because we have this down the seam and we're only cutting this strip, that really shouldn't make a difference. So I would just come down here. Again, be careful not to cut into the next unit. All right. The other thing you can do is take this and fold it out of the way, right, as you move down. So you can see, we're just going to cut these units apart, and then in the next video, I'll show you how to make that next cut, and then we'll be ready to sew these together. All right, so I have my units cut apart. So now we are on step 10, where we're going to make one more cut on these units to make 8 of these, which we will sew together into our block. So all you're going to do is flip these around the other way, and then it's going to have 2 ways again for cutting. So if you've got my angle ruler, or if you don't. If you don't have my angle ruler, then you're going to do that same thing. You're going to find the longest line you can, and you want to be able to have some come down the unit a ways, but that is going to go on this seam. You can see that it's pointing to that seam, and you really should be flush with the side of your unit at this point, and you would make that cut, okay? Same thing with using my angle ruler. The 67.5 is the angle that you would use. We'll grab another unit here, and we're going to put that 67.5 on this same seam. And you can see you've got more of the ruler going down your pie, so you know everything is lined up well, and you would just go ahead and make that cut. So you're going to do that to all 8 of your units. Do one more here. Yeah, and I sometimes give this little tap here. You want to make sure, sometimes as when you put it down, it kind of wants to come over on you because of the seam. Just kind of give it a little tap so it's sitting up nice and straight. All right, so you get the idea. For the skinny, for the fat, same thing. If you're using my angle ruler, we're going to use one of these lines. And again, you really should be flush here. You're not at the skinnies, you kind of had a flat area here. For the fat, it looks like we're just going to come pretty much to the point. I round up the strip width, so sometimes, depending on what size block you're going to make, that will come to a point or not. All right, if you do have my angle ruler, we're going to use that 82.5 degree angle. Again, you really should be flush. Make sure that's staying nice and straight. And that is going to be your cut. So I'm just going to continue making this cut on all 8 units, and then we are getting close. When we come back, I will talk to you about getting these sewn together to make our raw block. Okay, we're ready to sew our units together to make our compass sunflower block. So if you look at the top of page 4 there, it's going to show you how we're going to get them set up, what seam that we're trying to match. If you just kind of get 2 units together, you can see we are going to be matching this seam, the 0.2 seam to this 0.2 seam. Same thing for the fat. So you can kind of see how they are going to come together to make a circle. Now, by matching that seam, that's what's going to get it all to come together and to come out in a perfect circle. So I'm going to take half of my units. I'm going to get them set up like it looks at the top of page 4. So I've got these face down and these just remain face up. Same for the fat, okay? Then we've got that arrow over, right? So we know that we're going to match. We're going to cross this one over and we're matching this seam to this seam. So let me just bring 2 together here. All right. So these seams are not going to butt up. They're at different angles. So here's a little tip for you to help kind of get them lined up. So I first would take my straight edge ruler to the unit that is facing down. I'm going to run my 1/4 inch line up the raw edge, and I'm going to stick my pin right into the stitching, right next to the ruler, right? So now I have my pin a 1/4 inch over from the raw edge, all right? Now on this unit, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the 1/4 inch line down the raw edge. And now I simply, to get this to match up, I'm going to put the pin in the seam next to the ruler. So now I've got both of those a 1/4 inch in. When you bring the edges together, right, you want to make sure you have your pin perpendicular, right? Nice up and tight, and then bring that pin nice and up and tight. Make sure your edges are together, and I would stick another pin here just at the top, okay? Let me pin a fat one, and then we'll talk about the sewing. So same thing, we'll bring 2 over here. So I'm crossing this one over this one, right? So I'm matching this seam to this seam. So again, use my straight edge ruler. I'm going to lie it down the raw edge. 1/4 inch line down the raw edge, and I'm going to stick that into the stitching right next to the ruler. Run this down the other side. Then I'm just going to stick this pin right into the seam next to the ruler. All right, again, get your edges together. Make sure that pin is nice and perpendicular. Bring it up nice and tight. Stick another pin up here at the top. All right, and now we are going to sew. Set these aside. So I've already sewn a couple here so that you can see what the sewing is like. So in step 11, it's going to tell you this time, instead of sewing from the inside to the outside, we're actually going to start at the outside and sew in. Remember, this is Las Vegas out here. So when you get these edges matched up here, you're not trying to make a V or anything out here. You're just matching your edges. However it comes together is where you're going to start sewing. So you'll start sewing our true 1/4 inch seam, right? We'll come down past this first seam. Then you should be sewing basically right through where your pin goes into the fabric. Now, for the first unit or 2, I would recommend, instead of sewing that whole seam, just sewing 3 or 4 stitches through that pin, opening it up. Make sure you're happy with how it's matching up. If you're happy, close it back up, leave those stitches in, and then go ahead and sew right over those stitches. Everybody's going to have to find their own happy spot. Many things will affect getting that seam to come together, including your thread weight, how you've pinned, your feed dogs on your machine. So it might take 1 or 2 to kind of get that figured out so that you're happy. And then in step 11, um, at the bottom here, it's talking about how to finish sewing here at the bottom. If you're doing a round applique center or if you're doing a reverse applique center. And we are going to do a reverse applique center. So it's going to tell you when you get to this last seam, you're just going to go over it and then you're going to back stitch here because this is going to be a pressure point that could come apart. So we want to give a couple of back stitches here. So again, we're going to sew from the outside, basically through our pin, and you can deal with your pin how you normally do. You can, take it out right when you get to it. You can hand turn your wheel over it. I sew right through my pins. I just go slow. But however you want to do it. And then when you get to this last seam, make sure you go over it and back stitch. Now note that all of these seams have been pressed up. So don't start trying to push these seams over the other way now. They need to stay the way that you press them. And on the back, you want to make sure this seam right here sometimes can buckle underneath when you sew. So make sure you keep that so it's nice and flat. So it should look really good on both sides. All right, once you get it sewn, before we press, you're going to want to make sure, right, whether you're doing just those 3 or 4 stitches or you've sewn it, that you're happy with how this is matching up. So that seam should match as closely as you can there, okay? Then let's talk about the pressing. So you're basically going to make 4 of these to start. And let me grab my pressing board here so I can just show you quickly. All right, so again, on the top of page 4 here, it's going to show you how to get your units set up to press. So you're going to want to have them facing toward the right. Got my skinny here and my fat here, same pressing. You're going to set your seams, and then you're going to press up and away, okay? Now in the middle here, right, it's going to want to turn this under, and that is fine, but you don't have to worry about making it perfect. Just make sure it's turned under all the way to there. I'm trying not to iron out on my unit, and I'll turn this over so you can see. So it's that seam is going right up. Here in the middle, it doesn't really matter what happens because that's going to get sewn and it's going to overlap. So you don't have to worry too much about the middle. So same thing for the skinny here. So we'll press this up and away. Hold my iron in place, okay? So you can see it's staying up all the way to where that stitching ended, right? And then what happens there in the middle is okay. So you're gonna make 4 of these, either your skinny or your fat, and then we'll come back and we'll put these together to make 2 halves, and then we'll continue on from there. Okay, so we've sewn to make our 4 quarters, and now we're going to put those quarters together to make the 2 halves. So here are my quarters, and it's just a good idea at this point, right? Turn them over, make sure all the seams are still laying flat. And nothing new here, it's just that they look a little different because now they're bigger pieces, but we're still matching this seam to this seam for the skinny. So you're going to line those up the same way. So I'm going to turn this one over, put my ruler down the raw edge, stick my pin into the stitching, right next to the ruler, and then do the same thing here. And then stick that pin right into the seam next to the ruler. All right, then we're going to bring that up. Make sure the pin's perpendicular. Bring that pin up nice and tight. Stick another pin up here. All right, and that's ready to sew. I'm going to show you how to do the fat, and then I actually have sewn a couple, so I can show you that and then the pressing. So same thing, right? We are matching this seam to this seam. See how it's going to make it come into a perfect circle. So I'm just going to turn this one over. Run my ruler, 1/4 inch line down the raw edge into the stitching. Same thing over here. And put that into the seam. All right, so we'll get that, my edges together, get that pin nice and perpendicular, and bring it up. Okay, so I've already sewn my skinny and my fat. There's the fat and there's the skinny. So nothing's changed with the sewing, right? We're going to start from the outside, keep those edges together, use our nice true 1/4 inch seam. Past the first seam, you should be sewing through your pin. When you get to the last seam, you just go over it and back stitch, and then we're going to press. So pressing is the same. You want your units facing right to the right. The outside is over here. And we just continue pressing up and away. Okay, so we just want to get that seam going in the proper direction. Hold the iron there for a minute. When we turn it over, right, we just want to make sure that seam is going up all the way to where I stopped stitching. So you can see I'm not ironing, I'm really just pressing. I'm just getting those seams to lay flat. So I've got a 1/2 of a fat there. Get the skinny pressed. Turn it over. So see, I've got just a little hiccup there, so I'm just going to take care of that now. Just hold my iron straight down. Again, no steam, right? So once I get these other 1/4 sewn together, I will have the 2 halves, right? And then when we come back, we're just going to sew one of those seams at a time, the 3rd seam and press it, and then the 4th seam and we'll press that. And when you get the 4th seam pressed, then you're going to stop, and then I'm going to give you a really good pressing demo so you can see how to get your block to lay totally flat, but most importantly, come to the right size. So you have your 2 halves now, and now we're going to sew the 2 halves together to make the whole. We're just going to do, we have 2 seams left, we're just going to do one at a time, press that before we do the last seam. So here is our skinny block. So nothing really changes here, right? We're going to be matching this seam to this seam and this seam to this seam, but we're just going to look at this one to begin with. So I'm going to turn this over, run my ruler, 1/4 inch line down the raw edge. Remember, it's this seam, so I'll stick my pin in there, and then on this side, run my 1/4 inch line down the raw edge. All right, and then this pin is going to go into the seam right next to the ruler. All right, so make sure, get that pin in there, it's nice and perpendicular. Bring that up, okay? Then you're going to go ahead and sew this seam. Same as we sewed the others, from the outside through this seam, through your pin, just over that stitching and stop. And then your pressing is going to be the same, right? So you're going to press up and away for that seam. Okay, next we have the fat. So let me set this aside. All right, so you can see how our fat block is going to come together. All right, so we are matching this seam to this seam, right? So we'll turn this over. Run our 1/4 inch line up the edge, stick our pin right into the stitching, and then run this up 1/4 inch line up the edge, and this goes into the seam. All right, get your edges together. Make sure that pin is nice and tight and perpendicular, and bring that up. Same thing, we're going to sew just like we've done before, from the outside past the seam through the pin just over the last seam and back stitch. Pressing will be the same, right? We'll be pressing up and away, just like we have all along. So I'm going to go ahead and sew and press these seams, and then we'll come back and talk about the last seam. All right, I've just sewn that 3rd seam and pressed it for both my skinny and my fat block. So now I have 1 seam left here to sew. So the same thing here, we're matching, as you can see, this seam to this seam. So you'll just have to turn this over in place here, run your 1/4 inch line up the raw edge, make sure you get your pin in the proper seam, and then same thing here. Run that 1/4 inch line up the raw edge. This will go into this seam. All right, we'll get our pin in here nice and perpendicular. We'll bring that up nice and tight. I'm going to stick another pin up here at the top. So now I'm going to sew just like I have before. But what's going to happen here in the middle, right, it's coming together in a circle. So you just want to make sure that you keep everything free underneath. You shouldn't have any problem, but this is why I just have you sew the 3rd seam and then the 4th seam on its own, so you're not having to deal with this twice. All right, so this would get sewn, and then you're going to press that up and away. And let me show you how to get the fat one sewn. So again, this last seam, right, this to this, so we'll turn this over, run our ruler up the edge, 1/4 inch line, get that into the seam. Same thing here. All right, so I'll get that, my edges together. It's a little trickier because it's coming together, right? So get that, pull that up nice and tight. And then I'm going to stick another pin up here. And then, yeah, you just want to make sure you're keeping everything free under here. You're just sewing down to that piece. So we're going to sew the same seam. We're going to press that up and away, okay? Then when we come back, I'll go to my larger pressing table. So a couple things we will do when we make the final press. So we're just pressing the raw block with a dry iron. Then we'll give it a final press. We'll talk about these instructions in the finishing chapter. And then we're also going to prepare the center for our reverse applique. So we'll do all of that once your block is together and you've got all the seams pressed in the way that they need to go. Okay, we've got the raw blocks put together and we're ready to give them a final press, as it talks about in your book here in step 13. And I just want to show you where that information is. So you notice finishing, right, is color coded, so it's going to take you to the blue chapter, light blue chapter for skinny. And down here it talks about a few words about pressing your raw block. And same thing, get to the right page here, same thing in the fat, okay? So I'm going to talk you through this. I'm not going to take the time to read this, but I just want you to know that information is in your book if you want to refer to it. And then after we get the blocks pressed, then we're going to do this reverse applique, get our blocks pressed for reverse applique. And what we're doing here, if you look at the bottom of page 3 here, the compass sunflower, you're going to get an octagon in the middle of your block when we're done. So I'm going to set these books aside so you can see what I'm doing. All right, so we'll start with the skinny block. And so your block really should be laying pretty flat right now, but it's not going to be laying totally flat because we've used a dry iron and we've been, sort of cautious in our pressing. So the first thing I do is I turn my block over and I make sure that all the seams are laying flat. Now I can see I've got one right there, right? That's kind of going back on me. So I'm not going to do any moisture yet. I'm still just using a dry iron. And I just want to make sure that all those seams are laying flat. Let's look at our fat block. So yeah, it looks pretty good. There's a little wiggle right there. So just hold your iron down on those seams that are trying to come back on you a little. All right, so that is looking good as well. Okay, I'm going to turn them back over, and now I want to give my blocks a measure. So we're measuring across the diameter from finished point to finished point, and it should be under 14 inches. This is a 14-inch ruler. So I am about a little over 13 3/4 here. And the same thing here. So you do not really want it at this point to be all the way to 14. And remember, we don't want our block to go all the way to 14 because when we go to finish this, we don't want to nip off those pretty points that we've created. We want it to finish under a little bit. But by the time we add a little moisture and make this flat, it's going to grow just a tidge and it should come right to size. So we'll start with the skinny. So you can either just use steam in your iron. I like to use one of these misters. It just has a nice light mist. And I'm just going to give a nice misting to my block on the back. And I'm just going to press from the inside to the outside. Again, I'm pressing, I'm not ironing, I'm not going like this, right? I'm just getting everything to lay nice and flat. Okay, turn that over and you can see it's getting flatter already. We still have to deal with the center. So let me come back. I just want to get this so you can kind of see. Hopefully you can see just in the little bit of pressing that I'm doing here. So I'm just going straight out. We don't want to go in a winding motion, but just that little bit of moisture is going to help everything just to lay a little bit flatter. Okay, turn that over now. And you can see it's already, I don't know if you can see, but I can see for sure. It's already laying flatter. All right, now we need to deal with that reverse applique center, and then our blocks are really going to go flat. So remember, we stopped sewing at the bottom of every one of those seams. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to pick this up all the way around to where that seam is, and I'll do it for you so you can see. I'm going to give it some good moisture in the middle there because I want this to be nice and crisp when I'm done. I'm going to start right here. I'm going to pick this up so it goes up to where I stop sewing. Then I'll pick up the next one, and these should be straight, right? Where you're pulling them up, they should be nice and straight. All right. Hold my iron. Okay, I'm going to turn my block so I can get to the other ones. Just continue on. I'm just pulling that up, pulling the next one up to where that stitching is, right? Where I stop stitching. And then finally the last one. Okay. And I can see I pressed a seam the wrong way there. It's easy to do. I'm just going to give it a little moisture and put it back where it belongs. All right. Now you can see I've picked those up. See that octagon shape? Oops, I did that one there. All right. Now we're going to turn it over. I'm going to give it one more mist. And I'm just going to press from the inside to the outside. I'm not really putting a lot of pressure on the iron. I'm just trying to get it. Now you can see this is totally laying flat. If I put my ruler on here now, oh, it's perfect. It's just under 14 inches where you want it to be. Okay, let's do the same thing for the fat. Give a little moisture in there to that center. We'll start on this side. We're just picking those up to where you don't want to create a lip there, so make sure when you're lifting those up, it's going right to where you stop sewing. All right, so I've got that half done. We'll turn it to the other half here. So again, just picking that up. Trying to press that seam the wrong way. Okay. And we're at the last one. Just hold my iron on there. Make sure so you can, oops. I'm going to give that a little moisture there. It doesn't want to stay. There we go. All right, so you can see that octagon shape. Make sure those all are nice and folded under. Give it one more press. And again, we're pressing from the inside to the outside. We're not winding. You don't want to get those points off of north, south, east, and west. And my block is going nice and flat. We'll give that a measure. Perfect, just under. So the points are just under the edge of my ruler. So that means I'm not going to risk cutting them off when we, depending on how we are going to finish these blocks. So that's your raw block. Now the last thing we have to do is we're going to get these centers put in. So when we come back, I'll show you a little bit, give you some more information. There is information in the PDF download about the size. We're going to just cut a square that we're going to put on the back, and you can fussy cut it if you want. So whatever the square you cut, you want to make sure that if you're fussy cutting something, you get the center in the middle of that square. But we'll talk about that when we get back. We'll get that put under and sewn in, and then you can go on to take these raw blocks and put them into any of the other small projects that are also going to be listed here in the small project part of my website. All right, now that we've got our blocks pressed and prepared for that reverse applique, now we just need to get a piece of fabric cut that's going to go up underneath here. And on your PDF download for making the raw block, for the skinny, I have you cut a 5-inch square of fabric, and for the fat, it's 6.5 inch. So if you're fussy cutting something, make sure you get that centered, whatever the motif is, and I'm going to fussy cut for both of these, in the middle of your square so that it'll end up in the middle when you get on here. You can also just place your block if you have a piece of fabric that you're, want to sort of debut. What's great about this is you can kind of just lay it on there to see if you're happy with it, and then do your fussy cutting from there. So I've got my squares cut, so now it's just a matter of getting them centered and pinned in. And this is really just going to be the way that it looks good to you. The center for this one, the flower is kind of organic, so it's not going to line up perfectly, but I'm going to get it to where I'm happy. So I like that. And then same thing here, we'll stick this underneath. And this one is a little more uh, even, so we can kind of use the pattern, right? Make sure we're the same distance all the way around, and then we know that's going to be centered. Also, make sure you're looking at your points. You probably want to be centered on the point 2 points, but you could be centered on the point 1 points if you'd like. It's just going to give you a little bit different look. So you just want to get it lined up the way that you're happy. All right, once you've got that done, I just put in a few pins. So I'm going to stick my pins in, and I usually do one and then I go to the opposite side. So I'm just kind of eyeballing here to make sure I've got those even. Kind of doing this upside down, so all right. And I like to get the pins all going with the heads at this end, so as I'm sewing, it's easy to pull them out. All right. All right, so for that one, really 4 pins is all you need. For this one, I might put in a couple more. Let's get this so I'm centered. But definitely do the north, south, east, and west first. Okay, yep, and then I'm just going to put another pin on these other 4 points just to make sure that everything stays good. And now all I'm going to do is go to my machine and I'm just going to top stitch or edge stitch all the way around the perimeter of this. Once it's edge stitch, I'll go to my pressing board, I'll give it one more press, and then your block really is ready to go. So when we come back, I'll show you my last press and you'll see the raw block ready to move forward into your small project. All right, I've got the centers edge stitched in, so I'm just going to give it just a little mist, give it a little press so everything goes nice and flat. I'm really happy with how these blocks turned out. I hope you had some fun in the construction process. The last thing I probably will do now is turn them over. Again, just double check everything's looking good. And then I'm probably just going to cut out some of this fabric from the back. So I'm going to make sure I'm at least probably about 3/8 inch over from this octagon shape. Just being careful not to cut into your block at this point, but just to get rid of some of that bulk. You don't need that bulk in there for moving forward into your next projects. So almost done with this one, and then I'll trim the next one, but I won't take the time to show you all that process, but just so you can see, just taking some of that bulk out of the block. So trying to remember which way was my happy way. That's the way that I want to see it finished. So then I'll just come in here and do the same thing for this one. So now we've got our blocks ready to move forward into any of those other small projects. And hopefully this tutorial was helpful for you to understand just the process for making the raw block. So here we go, on to bigger and better things.